So another question coming in from Caitlin Fullup. She says, if relationships are broken because of past leadership, how do you introduce the possibility of growing through relationships through a small group with the congregation once again? Or what's the potential, I guess, for small groups to heal some breaches within a congregation or things like that? And I guess there's probably multiple angles that you could take that from, but would someone like to speak to that issue?
Yeah, I'll jump in again. I definitely want to acknowledge there's hurt out there. Unfortunately, the church sometimes doesn't behave the way it should, and those are tough things that happen out there. Part of it is, though, in perspective. I've been hurt in other relationships, but it doesn't mean relationships are bad. I've gone to restaurants and had, a bad meal, but that doesn't stop me from eating at other restaurants. And so part of what I want to be able to do is come alongside that person. They're very obviously they're hurt, and it's a scary environment. So you may want to do a little extra TLC to get them into a group. But part of it is understanding that we're living in a broken world and people aren't perfect. So, how can you help them take that step? Because it's going to be a risky step for them, a big step of faith to say, okay, I've been hurt by a church or been hurt by some experience with people. How can I do that in a safer environment? And that may be letting them experience, in your group or taking some other steps that, get them in with a group leader that's sensitively aware to that process. But those would be some places I'd start.
Yeah. And perhaps even thinking as you're thinking, Joy and Captain Danny, what if that difficulty or that pain has something to do with the leadership in that church as well, if you want to throw that into the mix, Captain Danny or Joy?
Well, I'm glad you added that and then gave it to them.
Well, it's a matter of being sensitive to the needs, and if the need is to be healed, to restore. With the help of prayer and the Holy Spirit, be guided in that, and that could be the very first start of a healing group. Let's start and let's start discussing our feelings, and that will facilitate. That will be more easy to do in the context of a small group. So that would be even an excuse to start doing it.
I think the only thing I would add is just to kind of say again what Steve was saying, is that brokenness comes through relationships, but the only way healing comes is through relationships too. Yeah. So
you said it nicer. I like that.
Thanks. Right. No, I mean that's the only way through and the only way to healing is through relationships. So it's a very scary thing. And we have to come alongside our broken people, especially our broken people, so that they can find healing.
Yeah, appreciate that. Here's a question that is coming from Rondo. Is there a startup model to follow if my core or church does not have small group? How do you get trained for this? Is there something that core officers and lay leadership can train on their own in order to teach others? How can local people become resources within their church so that they can sustain a model of small group growth and so forth? So, and what's out there for people?
Well, there are different modules to follow, and there's the organic model. It's different types of approach, but the key aspect for me is groups have to have a purpose. So once you establish what would be the reason why we're getting together beyond just doing for the sake of doing, then you can choose and pick and choose whatever model. It could be by free market model. We align very much with the Steve Gladen approach of groups with purpose and things like that. I mean, there's different resources, and we have here at the Lay Leadership Bureau, there's different resources on training that can be provided. I guess Joy also have the responsibility of providing those trainings. So first there would be the need to do an assessment of what's the environment, what the community, what the core needs, and not just thinking inwardly, but also what the community outside needs as well.
Yeah, I think, when I was hearing the question, I think they're asking, where are these resources? And the great thing about the Army, especially there at the headquarters in Nyack, they have a lot of great resources and people that will help walk you through what are these step-by-step projects. So if you haven't connected with, the headquarters there, those are some great starts there, between, Captain Gomez and Joy being able to jump in there is being able to say, you've got more resources than you realize right there at the headquarters. Probably what you're going to need help with is, how do I, ramp this out slowly enough so that I don't capsize my church in the middle of the ocean.
We're resource strong. Yeah. And anything to add on that, Joy?
No, I don't think so. I think that if people just want resources or a way, I think probably a one-on-one conversation with you or with Captain Gomez would probably be their best bet, or with somebody else, or another core officer or lay leader who has seen small group benefit at their core, and what did they do? You know what I mean? Because you have the other thing is you have a ton of options, so. Mm-hmm. And part of it is just choosing one and go, just.
Yeah. Don't wring your hands for too long. Just pull the trigger.
Yeah.
If I could jump in just so, when you're doing a group's ministry, it's going to be important. We talked about, working with your core officer and that, but for you who are running it, it's going to be important for you to know your end in mind. So, what are we trying to produce? What's success for that small group leader? Mm-hmm. And then be able to understand that group's going to start at some point and move in that direction. It's kind of like if I were going to invite you to my house and I just told you to come to the city I live in. Well, that's going to get you within 40,000 people. But if you want to get to my house, you're going to say, give me your exact address. And so that's that end in mind that they're going to be looking for. And your core officer can help you kind of figure that out. You're going to go along a pathway, but, as the group is going on this journey, because it's going on an expedition, and it's important to understand that when Boeing is building a plane, they know how many bolts, how many sheets of metal. They know exactly what it's going to take to build that plane. But what happens in church life is that we're on an expedition. We don't know the exact, where we're going. So it's hard to plan. But there are some things that you can do to make sure, that you pack the essentials. And so it's knowing that end in mind. It's knowing that your group is going on an expedition, but it's putting up a couple guardrails in place. And one of them is a head guardrail that that has, things like leader training and tools that will get them there, and curriculum that will provide it. But the other one is like a heart guardrail, and that's people that are going to come alongside that are going to be able to give course correction in case the expedition's going, a little off the beaten path, or
maybe people have been there before.
Exactly. And so you need people, you need processes along that journey. So as you're building your group's ministry, the things I say may sound daunting, but having been in Nyack, having been in the headquarters for many, many years, there's lots of resources that can help you build those guardrails to help you get to that end in mind you're wanting to do.
Thanks.
And I want to tap into the leadership aspect that it's very needed. I've heard stories of people trying to start the small group life at the core, and then they end up struggling because basically they've taken the leadership of that, but they didn't establish a system of producing new leaders. So developing new leaders. So it ends up being a burden rather than something beneficial. So I definitely consider one important aspect of the group ministry is to have a system of training leaders. So as groups grow, and one of the key words there is small groups. Once a group grows exponentially, it needs to be multiplied. It needs to 1 out of 2 out of 1, and then you will have leaders to take on the leadership role on those groups. It's very, very important.
And Captain Danny, we've talked about this in terms of sustainable leadership development, where for one thing, just if you want to take like the 3 points, now help me with this because I'm going off the top of my head here, but you want to work in increments with leaders. You want to develop leaders in the increments that they can handle, from leading a part of a lesson or a smaller part of the small group or whatever, to further levels. So it's got to be incremental. That it's got to be constant. You always have to be on the lookout for succession, for who's next, who's going to be leading these people, either when I'm gone or when I'm moved on to something else or whatever. It's got to be constant. And what's that third one? It's got to be sustainable. So yeah,
it needs that aspect of sustainability needs to be part of that plan, part of that end in mind. If we have a plan and a strategy that any course should take is to have that plan in mind with an end in mind. We have a purpose. This is what we want, and put those rail guards, as Steve was saying, that will help maintain the course.
Those bowling bumpers that help you get a strike, right?
Yeah.
So someone's tuned in. They're watching. They really, they're sitting where I've sat through many years in different, living in different places, different corps, where the corps officer is the most beautiful person in the world, has the most beautiful heart, but they really just haven't. It hasn't been a part of their own development or their own experience or their own education. Small group life and that sort of thing. It's been a part of my own formation, but. And you're like, boy, I'd really like to get this going. I'd like to speak, because we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to speak about real nuggets of wisdom, the most mundane sort of practical, useful increments that people can really implement right now, maybe even this week, into their life. Perhaps it's a great book that you'd like to suggest, a great website that you'd like to point people to. If there's, or perhaps it's an action that they could do. We already talked a little bit about that, but if you could put in your mind, what are some things that we can do? I know I was talking to one officer who talked about how when she was doing Corps Cadets as a Corps Cadet counselor, which is a youth program, beautiful curriculum, great idea. Instead of simply focusing on the curriculum, she made room within their meetings to have prayer time. And prayer is just so crucial when groups get together, Christian groups get together. She made room to say, this is not just about going through the motions of this curriculum. That's one thing that anyone can do right now, even in their Sunday school class. Don't worry about going through the entire, lesson. Make sure that you make an ample amount of room for prayer. What are some other things that we can do, real practical side?
I'll start with a simple change of mindset. For all my Salvationist friends, I remember when I sat under Steve Gladen's training, one of the things that literally blew my mind, was an aha moment, was the difference that there is between a church with groups and a church of groups. That brings the whole concept for me to a new level. Because yes, we have a lot of groups happening, but those groups don't make the whole of the church. Now, having those groups make the transition into being the church. So it's not just the core with lots of groups happening, and maybe each one of them with their own purposes and fulfilling their own task, and that's it. But all of those enriching and making what is the whole of the church. So that was one of the key things that in my personal experience happened. I changed my mindset. It's not just what we have to do and what's happening, but all of those things making the whole of the core.
Called Building a Church of Small Groups, and I'm trying to think of the name of the authors. It's maybe about 15 years old, but I can't remember the name of the authors. Building a Church of Small Groups, though.
Yeah, that was, I think I have it on my bookshelf. I'll see if I can remember it as I talk here. And
I'm looking at it, but my my eyes can't see it. I'm looking at it, my own bookshelf. Anything to add on the practical side there, Joy or Steve?
Ladies first.
Oh, I don't practically. I don't always do well with practical, but I would say
He's off the panel next week, so you know it is.
No, I just mean like the practical sides. I think the way to move from like program to relationship and small groups being the focus here. I think that the way to do that is just through relationship. We used to be an education-driven, program-driven kind of core, and that worked for the Salvation Army for years. It worked. And I think now it's meeting people where they are. So like my young adults, I text them during the week because I want to connect with them. I want to invite people to lunch and to coffee because I know that it's also about life outside of small group that adds to life inside small group. So
all right.
I don't know that answers the question.
That is actually great. I mean, do something outside of the program with those same people that are involved. And I think something beautiful, you didn't say it, but you enacted it, which is acknowledge the challenge. We could, you weren't, we're none of us are like ready with an answer, because if we're really thoughtful and we're really, we really know what's at stake, we recognize, this isn't an easy nut to crack, especially in the culture of the Salvation Army, where the structure does not lead toward community, toward small group community, and so forth. Our models of Christian growth do not often include, our testimonies of the Christian walk do not often include the formation of ourselves in community. And I just wanted, before Steve, I'm going to ask Steve to say the last word for us, but before that, I want to note something that when Captain Gomez and I were doing a training, there was something brilliant that was brought in by one of the delegates, and what we do is we showed a bunch of pictures, one of those pictures, and we said, go to a picture and tell us how it represents small groups. We had no commitments to the pictures. We didn't give any forethought really to the pictures we chose. We just put a bunch of pictures up, and one of those pictures was a grocery vegetable stand with a bunch of vegetables in it, and we just said, tell us how that's small groups. So you can picture that in your head. And the young woman was telling the rest of the delegates there, said, these fruit all got here somehow. And they didn't just arrive on the scene as fully formed fruit, ripe and ready to eat. There was a process of formation. And what happens in our meetings, now I'm extrapolating from some of what she said, so I'm combining that, but what happens in some of our meetings and some of our testimonies is we give a testimony of a typology of before and after, but we don't talk about between. We don't talk about the growth connected to the vine. And we talk about, I was in the gutter. Our testimonies tend to be Cinderella stories. I was this way and now I'm that way. But that does not help us to normalize growth within community. And so she was pointing out, look, all these went through a process of growth in order to get to this point. And what we need our leaders to do for us, and what we need people who are mature Christians to do for us, is to talk about that formation, not talk about the gutter and the, Prince Charming or whatever, but to talk about that process so that I can participate in that, you know? And so after Steve says a last word, I'm just going to give an announcement about our next On Point and so forth. And so Steve, I'm handing it over to you.
No, I mean, I think everyone's been bringing up just great things. I love that, you know, for a practical thing is I'd say, you know, if you're in your core, do a group on your own. I mean, I think Joy was hinting in that, and Captain Gomez was sharing with that even offline, how experience is some of the best teachers. So even if before you want to do it through your whole core, why don't you lead a group and just start it with a couple of your friends and just see what bubbles up in that. One of the things we always teach is that, you know, working against the Army motif here, but that, you know, small group ministry is always a political campaign. It's not a military campaign. And a military campaign goes to conquest something and take it over. But a political campaign works relationally through that and tries to say, you know, how do I influence people to understand what I feel so passionate about? So I think practically you could just start it with a couple of your friends, try it for 6 weeks and see the impact that it can have. I'd also, you know, work off testimonies. Find testimonies of people. If your core if that's not a natural part of who your core is, use testimonies from people. I mean, you're the used car salesman, but you know, somebody that has been through a group and can give a testimony about it can have a huge impact on the core leadership to understand, you know, what is happening. But then I think, you know, also just good dialogue of being able to say, what are we trying to do with this core? Yeah. If we have a perfect disciple next to us, what are they? And what do they exude? And then what's going to get us there? Because a lot of times churches are great and cores are great at starting things. We're never good at stopping things. And if we consume too much of people's weeks, they can't do what we want them to do, which is what the gospel is all about. Yeah. If they're in church the whole time and don't have time for anything else because they're exhausted, then we're working against ourselves. So it's having some honest reflection with that. So there's just all kinds, but to give you just some resources that are there, obviously I gave you my website. So, you know, jump in there. We also have a website for the smallgroupnetwork.com. It's peer-to-peer learning groups that we have throughout there. So you can check that out. We have a blog and many articles and, you know, podcasts that are available at smallgroupnetwork.com. And then, you know, my books might have a little bit of piece in there that can help you out. So,
and that those addresses will be in the comments too. So
great.